So Kimber's got a new double stack that is half the price of the 2K11. So we'll compare it to the 2K11 and then some of the other guns at that same price point. Just trying to understand, is the Warrior too good to be true, or will it kind of disappoint like some of the other price point 2011s? Howdy guys, it's David. This is the Kimber DS Warrior, and if this is one of your repeat videos, please consider subscribing. As far as the agenda, we'll go over what is a Warrior. We'll look at how it's different from the 2K11, both, by spec and performance. We'll compare it to the other guns sort of around this same price point, and then we'll finish with some of the negatives. And for full transparency, the gun is sent in by Kimber. You'll see it when we get to the negatives. I'm going to show you what warts I had. There weren't very many of them, but we'll get started now. The Warrior is Kimber's price point sort of 1911 spec 2011, if you will. It uses 1911 parts that cost less than 2011 parts. It uses a Kim Pro finish, which is sort of like a super smooth Cerakote. And it is using it as it relates to the 9mm, an aluminum frame rather than a steel, all in an effort to kind of engineer a gun to be built to a lower price point. There are steel frame variants of this that cost about $100 more, and they're released in currently other calibers of like 45 and 10mm, whereas the aluminum framed guns are specifically the 9mm guns. So what you see is basically a modernized 1911. The grip is a double stack, takes 2011 magazines. It's got a light rail, but it has the classic 1911 slide design, and specifically it's got a bushing barrel with a short GI style guide rod, not a full-length guide rod. And unlike the 2K11, which has an external extractor, this one has an internal extractor, as you can see there. So it is truly using the classic 1911 parts. MSRP on the 9mm aluminum version of this gun is $10.99, but I went and did some shopping. I can see that it's being listed in many places at $9.99, and I found on one of those deal buying websites that somebody, when you put it in your cart, was selling it for $8.75. So this is potentially available around $900, which is a heck of a buy considering what you get. And the gun comes with the standard Kimber gun bags, and it comes with one 17-round magazine and one 20-round magazine, so that's all to the good. It is an optics cut slide, but it comes with the old 2K11 plates, the C&H precision plates, not the ones that are currently being offered on the 2K11s. The trigger is a polymer shoe, and it's set heavier than what the 2K is. The trigger pull on my gauge will make it sound super heavy. Was pulling at 70 ounces, which is still, decent for sort of a price point gun. It's lighter than most guns at that sort of price point, but it's not a light trigger by 2011 standards. But the combination of a bushing barrel and an aluminum frame actually make this a very carryable, I realize it's a huge gun, but a very carryable huge gun if you can make it go away, which a good holster and belt will go a long way towards accomplishing. Accuracy wise, because usually in these price point guns, that's one of the things that you give. I could say price point guns like it's not an expensive gun, it's an expensive gun. But when I say price point, like this platform of gun usually costs, $2,000 to $3,000 for a, inexpensive one. And this is a, around $1,000 version of the gun. So usually what you give up when you buy a less expensive gun is the accuracy, because the barrel fit and the slide to frame fit is usually what's compromised to get that price down. And so the accuracy opens up. Accuracy was actually pretty good from this, from 25 yards. I shot it with Buffalo Creek ammunition using my fancy pistol rest at my fancy indoor gun club. And Buffalo Creek Ammo is a supporter of a channel, and I thank them for that.
I can't count to 10. There we go, that's 10. That's clearly me on the left, that's a flyer. Right, that's pretty good.
Now, I don't know the round count on the gun. It's north of 500 rounds, but probably not quite 1,000 rounds is where it's been. It's only been out with me 2 times, but the gun didn't have any issues setting off ammo, feeding ammo. I'm running out of hollow points, so I shot the ones I had, which is Hornady American Gunner. It shot those no problem. And the gun looks like I reviewed a couple years ago the Quantico high cap from Alchemy Custom Weaponry, which is a gorgeous kind of resto mod 1911, 2011 double stack, and this gun kind of looks like that, which I kind of dig. The specification is actually pretty similar to the Nighthawk President that I shot, years ago as well. Although this gun cost a fraction of what those guns cost. This clearly uses a bunch of the same parts as the 2K11, so let's look at what is different between the 2K11 and the Warrior to justify a huge reduction in price. So let's talk first about the finish, because that's the most obvious thing that's different. A anodized frame with a black Kimber finish for the slide and a stainless steel barrel with no finishing on the barrel versus a PVD finish on the slide, a DLC coated barrel and frame, and an anodized aluminum grip with a Cerakote magwell versus a polymer grip with no magwell. You can see just in the finishing of the gun that it's using like more basic finishes, which is going to keep the cost down. Next, coming up to sort of the 2011 stuff, the fluted barrel that you see there is a bull barrel profile with a toolless guide rod versus what you've got on the Warrior of a bushing barrel. If you've ever shopped for 2011 barrels, bushing barrels end up costing significantly less than bull barrels. I don't know why, it's just the way it is, but it's got a bushing barrel, which is a less costly one. The short GI style guide rod, which is, you know, a lot less metal than goes into one of these toolless guide rods. Coming up on top of the gun with the sights, this is a night sight on the front versus the TAG Precision fiber optic front sights on the 2K. This has got the TAG optic plate versus the C&H optic plate. The TAG one is steel versus the aluminum with the T-nuts on the C&H plate. The hammers are different. You've got kind of a stylized hammer on the 2K11 versus a more traditional 1911 style hammer. The safeties are the same from what I can tell, and the grip safeties are a little bit different. This one's got the memory bump at the bottom. This one is just a smooth, classic 1911 style grip safety. I don't have any issues making the grip safety go in so the gun can go off. And the polymer trigger shoe that's on the Warrior is very similar to like a staccato, whereas you have an aluminum trigger shoe that comes on the 2K11. Then the setup of the guns is different as well. The trigger pull on this is about 1.5 pounds lighter than the trigger pull on this. And obviously the steel subframe of this gun versus the aluminum subframe on this gun. This gun weighs just under 30 ounces without a magazine, but including the optic and plate, whereas this one weighs just under 40 ounces. So it's significantly heavier, but also it's not just that it's heavier, it's the weight distribution of where the weight is. All of the weight being in the subframe is below the center line of the bore. So the guns feel like they lift less in recoil, and because they are heavier when you're aiming at small targets in the distance, the guns are easier to steady. Just heavier guns are easier to shoot at long distance targets versus kind of lighter weight guns. And if you look at the slow-mo, you can kind of see it. The first shot isn't wildly different between the two, but I like to shoot 5 shots when I do the slow motion video. And that's because as the shots progress, you can see that the gun starts to oscillate more and more on the lighter weight gun versus the 2K, which continues to stay a little bit more serene. Backed up and shot at the 25-yard line. We'll go 2K first here. So only one shot thrown off, super easy shooting, locked in grip, not a problem. The lightweight Warrior, you can see right there, it's starting to get the dead skin cells because the gun wants to rotate because it's lighter weight. But let's see what it's like at 25 here. Only one off with it as well. Pace was a little bit slower, but not a lot slower. If it's like a range gun or something like that, the steel frame is going to be the softer shooting of the two. But at the same time, a full-size single-action trigger gun at 25 yards is a nice thing to have. So yeah, the steel frame gun is going to be a little bit easier to shoot just by virtue of being heavier than the aluminum frame gun. And that's generally true. It's not a Warrior thing. It's like an all guns thing. Heavier guns are usually easier to shoot than lighter weight guns. It's probably like the #1 characteristic that makes a gun easier to shoot than another. But that difference is only realized at kind of the edge of where handguns are kind of a practical solution. If you're shooting kind of close range and just running the trigger and gripping the snot out of the gun, it's not really a big deal. And when I say close range, I'm talking like 15 yards and in. At those distances, the guns are basically the same gun. It's not a huge difference. So that's kind of the performance difference. For the quality difference is like this gun is just built to a lower spec, so it costs less money. I think the gun is actually executed quite well, and we'll talk about that in the context of the other guns that we're talking about. So the other guns that we're looking at is kind of the classic price point 2011, which is the Prodigy. We've got the Live Free Armory Apollo 11. This is the Gen 1 version of the gun. If you want to see a video on the Gen 2 version, I've got one of them on order. I'll have a video as soon as it shows up. So subscribe to the channel if you want to see the Gen 2 version. And the gun that's probably closest in spec to what the Warrior is the Gerson 2311, the Witness 2311. And I say that because this has an aluminum frame and a bushing barrel. However, it has a full-length guide rod and not a GI style guide rod. We'll start talking about the finish. The finish on this is kind of Kimpro, which is Kimber's version of a paint. It's like a Cerakote as far as its like durability is concerned, but it's a much smoother finish. It feels almost like a DLC, if you know how smooth DLC is, versus a more traditional Cerakote gun. Live-Free Armory is a Cerakote gun. It just kind of has a little bit of texture to it. It's just the way Cerakote is. And the Prodigy similarly is a Cerakote gun. The Gerson it just says blue black. So is this a blued slide? I guess it doesn't feel like a blued slide, but that's what the website says it is. It's holding up better than a blued slide in fairness, but you know, that's what they say that's what they say on the website, so we'll believe them. But they're all pretty similar. If you actually mess with the guns and sort of, you know, test the slide to frame fit, and then you push on the barrel to see how it unlocks, the Kimber has a marvel cut in the round stripping sort of ramp at the bottom of the slide, so the disconnector is cleared by it, so it's very smooth sort of front to back. The only kind of hitches that you see as I move that is the short GI style guide rod that is making the spring kind of bind up. The full length guide rods will smooth that out, as you see on the 2K11, because the 2K11 just looks smoother as a result of having that full length guide rod there. Whereas you get to the Gerson, it's a little bit looser sort of slide to frame. The barrel fit is decent. It doesn't, you know, take a Herculean effort to unlock. You have similar amounts of binding. This is a commander gun, so it's got a heavier spring in it, so it's naturally going to feel a little bit more in trying to get the slide to cycle. The Prodigy is interesting, and I know I'm not the only one who's got issues. Now, this is a happy issue that I have on my Prodigy. My Prodigy has a poorly fit barrel, so when you try to unlock the gun, it takes quite a bit of force, which is why it's difficult to smoothly unlock the gun. It's just the locking lugs are not fit super good on this gun. Doesn't affect the accuracy. It actually makes the gun softer to shoot, but when you actually try to like manipulate the gun, it definitely has that quirk. It does kind of bind up on the disconnector a little bit. I just lubed the gun, so I can't really show you, but you can see it kind of hitches on the disconnector. And the Live-Free Armory Apollo is similarly pretty, you know, similar tolerance, maybe a little bit looser than the Kimber. As far as, you know, what stands out different about the Apollo is that it comes with a 3D printed grip. This is kind of a love it or hate it sort of item on the gun. It's strange feeling. It's not like other grips, but it's got the 3D printed grip on that. The Prodigy has a polymer grip with an excellent texture. This is one of my favorite polymer grip textures, and it just comes on the gun out of the box, which is cool. Unlike a lot of the other Turkish guns, the Gerson actually comes with a pretty good polymer grip. The other Turkish guns or price point guns tend to have pretty slippery grips, and this doesn't have that problem at all. And similarly, the Kimber Warrior has a pretty darn good, this is the same grip module that comes on the 2K11 comps. This is Kimber's new proprietary polymer grip module. It's got like carbon fiber in it and all this stuff, some fancy form of polymer, but it actually works pretty darn well. It's you can kind of see the dead skin cells that are building up where my support hand interfaces with the gun. So the grip does what it needs to do. It is a pretty good Goldilocks texture, meaning it bites you when you try and squeeze it, and you can carry it and it doesn't tear up your stomach. So it's a pretty good grip. Looking at the slow motion of how the guns shoot against the Prodigy is about 10 ounces heavier than the Warrior, so it's just a little bit more serene, plus that happy accident with the barrel fitting makes it shoot very, very softly. Similarly, versus the Apollo is a heavier gun with a steel subframe, so it's just a little bit softer shooting than the aluminum frame Warrior. And the Gerson 2311, being similar in weight to the Warrior, shoots pretty similarly. Now, this is a commander gun with a commander stroke length, and it's got a heavier recoil spring. All of that affects how the gun moves. What a commander stroke length means is that the slide doesn't move as far to the rear as it does on a 5-inch government model. So the sensation of recoil is faster on this because the slide is moving back and forth a little bit quicker, both from the less length of travel as well as the more powerful spring throwing the slide closed. So there's that. We need to talk about extraction and ejection because that's usually a corner that's cut on these price point guns. The Kimber's extraction and ejection, if you watch the shooting footage, is great. The extraction pattern was about 5 to 6 feet at my 4 o'clock, which is exactly what you want. That's a super consistent throw. The Apollo similarly threw the brass exactly where you want, although it was a little bit more random with the ejection pattern, although it was totally good. The Prodigy doesn't throw it as far because of its barrel fit issues. It only throws the brass to the same area about 3 feet from the shooter, which is too close because if you slow that slide down, you're going to create errors. But in that gun's defense, it's only had one malfunction ever, and it was with a SIG V crown that it didn't want to feed. And the 2311 had the most erratic ejection, to kind of throwing them up and not out to the side, and it even choked. So yeah, there was that.
And it choked on it right there.
And we're gonna actually talk about kind of my negatives, and then we'll talk about like concerns, which are, you know, may or may not be issues depending on where you fall on them. The only negative that I have is the C&H plate. It comes with the Loctited screws, like pre-Loctited to mount them to the slide. They use way too much Loctite, and the screws aren't the strongest screw because this is a screw head from one of those screws. These screws actually sheared because the Kimber mounting pattern takes 4 screws. You can limp along with 3, and they work just fine with 3 screws holding them on, although 4 is what's supposed to be there. So this is being held on with only 3 screws. And the other thing about the C&H plates is they use these little thin diameter screws to hold the optic on. Whatever optic you mount on those will not use the screws that come with it. You have to use the C&H kind of thin diameter screws, and I don't love those because they're, you know, super fine threads on super thin screws. So what can happen is that if you use too much Loctite and too much torque, you'll end up locking the optic onto the slide and accidentally snapping the screw heads off, which creates a problem. But the C&H plates do work just fine if you install them correctly, but my recommendation is purely all the screws that come pre-Loctite. This is true of all screws really. Just take a wire brush and get all of the pre-Loctite off and Loctite it yourself so you know it's done correctly. So that's kind of an operator error with me using too much force to try and get the screw to go in. However, there was too much Loctite on the threads, and that's why the screw bound. The only other kind of potential negative is that the way Kimber cuts its subframes, it will not accept MBX mags. That's not a problem for kind of the general population because they don't buy MBX mags. Competitive shooting guys do. MBX mags don't work in Kimber guns. It's not a huge deal. It works just fine with basically all the other magazines. So the Atlas, Checkmate, Staccato mags, all that works fine in these guns, but you can't use MBX. And the last one is more of a concern, is the fact that this gun is not kind of 2011 spec. If you go on any of the forums or Reddit or any of the places people geek out about 2011s, most people with 2011s want to see a full-length dust cover. They want the steel subframe. They want a certain kind of look and feel. This gun doesn't really have all that. It has more of a classic kind of 1911 aesthetic, which honestly I like. I think it's cool. But if you want sort of the traditional 2011 look with the full-length dust cover, steel subframe, and all that kind of stuff, then this gun doesn't really have it. However, I do think that the gun is super well executed for what it's trying to be. And that's kind of where I land on it. I think for the money, this gun is incredibly well executed. Of the price point guns that we looked at, if you just kind of manipulate it and mess with it, I think it feels like the highest quality offering of those guns. Plenty accurate for a price point gun, which is one of the things that you have to kind of check on sort of the less costly offerings of these things, but it's just super well executed. Some dudes aren't necessarily gonna want to hear that, but I mean, at this point, I probably have over 10,000 rounds through the 2K11 platforms, not through this Warrior specifically. And the guns just run, dude. They're pretty great guns. I think the gun is really well suited as being like a project gun if you wanted to sort of build it up with like an ignition kit. It takes the same magwells as the Kimber aluminum frame gun. So if you get a stand-chin magwell for it, you could throw one of those on there. It'd be a great entry into like the limited optics world or potentially, you know, IDPA carry optics. And you can kind of see what the fuss is about with the double stack 1911s and see whether they're for you or not without spending all of your money on picking one up. If you want to see my 6,000 round review on the Kimber 2K11, you can watch that here. As always, I appreciate you guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.